The SD40-2 is widely heralded as the greatest diesel locomotive that was ever built, and January 2022 represents 50 years since the model was introduced to the railroads. Some Union Pacific SD40-2s were set up to run along with the Centennials and geared to run 79 miles per hour as opposed to the typical 70 miles per hour. The initial synopsis was to have SD40-2B units, but the decision was made to take existing locomotives, upgrade them to run faster, and put them behind the Centennials. Over time, Union Pacific began to run them in locomotive consists outside of the Centennials in 2s and 3s, in Utah, Nevada, and California. By the mid-1980s, the UP decided that while the special units had their uses, a more standard, uniform fleet was better, and many were rebuilt back to their original gearing. They were called the Fast 40s, and they were rebuilt in the late 70s to around 1987. Burlington Northern had more SD40-2s than any other railroad. They were known to run them in 2s and 3s, 4s, and even 5s throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s. They were eventually replaced on coal trains by the SD70 Max. Most made it into the BNSF merger, and a few still wear their Cascade Green Burlington Northern paint to this day. The Chessie system was known for the K5LA air horn and their blue fuel tanks and trucks. The Chessie paint scheme was a vibrant change to the bleak and drab paint schemes of the other railroads of the East of the time period, such as the Pennsy, the Central, and their successor, the Penn Central. NS and CSX rebuilt many of their SD40-2s with Admiral cabs for NS or SpongeBob Square cabs for CSX. CSX rebuilt theirs as SD40-3s. The Dash 3 is the latest evolution to the EMD electrical card system. It makes locomotives run better and more efficiently. Lots of railroads are switching to the Dash 3 systems, and CSX was one of the first railroads to do it. In the 2010s, they were looking for alternatives to motive power because the Tier 4 emissions deadlines were creeping up on them, and if CSX and the railroads in general wanted new locomotives, they would have to invest about $5 million per new locomotive from GE, which was a really steep price tag. So they went back to the drawing board and asked, what can we do with existing equipment to be more fuel efficient and cut down on emissions without having to spend $5 or even $6 million on a brand new locomotive? Their solution was the SD40-3s. The first 50 units were built in Huntington, West Virginia, with an NRE, that's National Railway Equipment Design cab. They featured new air dryers and also had upgraded electronics in the cab, as mentioned before. They had climate control, HVAC systems that was a great upgrade from the factory specs, as the original locomotives didn't have AC, and that was a bane on those hot summer days in the South. The air start feature is a really neat thing too. It's a delayed start with some beeping, and then the prime mover turns over. The cabs were crash-worthy, and they're unique with the anti-climbers and their overall look. On the CSX SD40-3s, they have an electronic air brake on the rear on a stand along with directional ditch lights. NS and CSX both have front and rear ditch lights on their SD40-2 rebuilds. NS was about a year behind CSX when they introduced their Curry Rail Admiral cab. The reason they were called the Admiral cab is because there was a Navy admiral who worked with NS on the board of directors, and he spent a lot of time sailing across the oceans, and one of the things that he noticed is that the windows of the ships were always slanted forward to prevent glare. Like CSX, NS Admiral cabs were designed for crashworthiness, so there was a lot of steel used, just like the Crescent cabs. NS has front and rear anti-climbers, and some units have electronic air brakes. Others still have the wheel. NS SD40-2 rebuilds have the K5LA air horn, just like the Chessie system SD40-2s that we just talked about, and their first rebuilds were Southern Railway high hoods. The Southern Railway SD40-2 high hoods had two different paint schemes, the early gold lettering and the deluxe 1979 yellow lettering. The Southern Railway engines had P3 and P5 air horns. In real life, the yellow and logos were reflective. They also had the electrical conduit for locomotive operation, as Southern Railway was one of the innovators of radio-controlled DPU operations that they developed in the 1960s. Louisville and Nashville GP40s were built in the 1960s, and some had 2,600-gallon fuel tanks, with others having larger fuel tanks. They had Leslie RS3L horns, and most made it into CSX and have been rebuilt to Dash 2 specs. Penn Central's 170 GP40s were leased as they really couldn't afford to outright buy their motive power at the time. Their GP40s were leased for 15 years and some ended up on the Rio Grande after the Conrail merger. Like their GP38s, they were pretty bare bones minimal, but they did have the RS3L horn. The Milwaukee Road went all the way to the Pacific Northwest and had contemplated a merger with the Erie Lackawanna, which would have made America's first coast-to-coast railroad system. They reached southern Indiana and almost into Louisville, Kentucky, and ran a lot of coal trains on that line. It might just ponder a person as to why they went so many places they seemingly didn't belong, and the answer was simple: grain. They needed to be able to serve a lot of grain elevators in the Midwest, and they had a lot of lightweight rail branches that needed 4-axle locomotives. They initially turned to EMD and the GP9s, which they absolutely loved, but they eventually required a locomotive that could be used on the branch lines and the main lines. Her name is Rio, goes the Duran Duran song. Denver and Rio Grande Western's GP40s were delivered in 1971 for a total of 43 units, not counting the ones that they would get from the Penn Central after the Conrail merger. They were used in mainline and in branch line service, including potash trains. The Rio Grande touted through the Rockies, not around them, and non-turbocharged locomotives didn't fare well in the higher elevations of the Rio Grande. They could be seen in groups of 5, 6, 7, and even more as they battled the grades of the Rocky Mountains. One small prototype detail is that Rio Grande GP40s originally had the EMD-style number boards. In time, they were replaced with the Burnham-style square corner number boards. They had 3,600-gallon fuel tanks and the Mars light. Rio Grande had gyro lights and Mars lights. The Western Pacific was a railroad that was built out of spite and competed with the Southern Pacific for many years. It interchanged with the Rio Grande in Salt Lake City, Utah, so it was common to see GP40s from either road together. Rio Grande had 43 GP40s. The Western Pacific had 44. Built in 1971, the Western Pacific GP40s were painted in pearlman green as opposed to the orange, silver, and gray of earlier years. The Western Pacific had gyro lights on their locomotives. The AC44C6M is basically an AC4400CW. The BNSF had 120 of them delivered in 2003. The Canadian Pacific Mounted Police Musical Ride AC4400CW number 9618 had English on one side and was written in French on the other. Some Southern Pacifics had the yellow sill striping once merged into Union Pacific. The Union Pacific had more AC4400CWs than any other railroad, at least up until Norfolk Southern began rebuilding their Dash 9s. Some of the UPs had yellow and some had the red sill frame stripe. The red UP sill frame stripe was reflective, so when the FRA adopted their rules for the striping that it had to be yellow or white. A good example of this is the Canadian National adding the yellow sill frame stripe to the Illinois Central Death Star locomotives. The poor UP had to replace all, or at least most, of their locomotives' sill frame striping. The GP40 was a locomotive that was not original to the Chicago and Northwestern roster. They were instead ex-New York Central and among the first GP40s that were ever built. Like some found on the Rio Grande, they were acquired from EMD in 1980 after their 15-year lease expired on Conrail. They went on to Precision National, who sold them to the CNW. The CNW went to rebuilding them, most notably with the signature CNW gong bell on the nose and the RS3LR horn. Did you notice the 3 trailing 40-2s in the last up? The first is a GP40-2 and the other 2 are SDs. The one of interest to us is the third unit, SD40-2 number 3483. Why? Very simple. Because over the years, this particular locomotive has put in a lot of work in northeastern Pennsylvania.